welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Tommy Brzee. It is Thursday, May 23rd, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about the House versus NCAA settlement that is getting down the road, more and more people approving that, and with that comes a little bit of a problem in college football with some of the money going around is a little bit harder to find the money for. It's a little bit harder to find the money to pay all the bills, and it sounds like private equity might be coming into the picture to fix that. Also, we have some allegations against James Franklin that he was involved in possibly altering or interfering with medical decisions during his time at Penn State. Then we are going to get into USC and if they're ready for the Big Ten before finishing off with a hot take Thursday about the upcoming Heisman and what I think is going to happen there. But before we jump in today, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, maybe get to know each other a little bit, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a fun kind of interactive experience here, and I think that's always fun for the both of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about what has happened over really the last 24 hours. We've talked about this House versus NCAA settlement for quite some time. It is the NIL back pay case that is going to total somewhere around $2.7, $2.8 billion for the NCAA. It sounds like about 1.1 of that is up to the NCAA to cover, but 1.6 of that goes out across the entire country and is pulled away from what the allocation would be for those teams, usually from the NCAA. So certain teams are losing a certain percentage of their revenue they get from the NCAA every single year over the next 10 years as they kind of pay for this lawsuit. It's going to be about, I think, $277 million a year for about a decade. So definitely going to be quite the hit for a lot of teams. We talked about it earlier in the week that some of the smaller conferences are not being necessarily heard from a lot in these conversations just because they're smaller conferences and they hold less weight in these conversations. So it's definitely going to hurt them a lot more than it's going to hurt the big guys. But wouldn't you know it, the big guys are the only one that have a vote. So it sounds like the NCAA has approved this. The Big Ten has approved it yesterday. The Big 12 and the ACC both did the same as well. And the SEC and the Pac-12 are set to meet this up, I think, later today, actually. And they're going to approve this. There's almost no doubt in my mind that this will go through. And we'll have to deal with whatever repercussions come because of this. Because it's going to be a weird time. We know that it opens the door for revenue sharing, which is something that I think a lot of people around the sport have been pushing for quite some time. It's going to be 22% of the annual average revenue for those schools, so around $20 million a year. Now, that number is a little bit fluid where you can go well below that number if you absolutely need to, which is a problem that we'll get to in the next segment, why some teams are looking in other directions for that money. So a lot of this kind of goes back to the idea that it's going to be really tough to box out the big boys at this point. And a lot of these smaller conferences, a lot of these smaller entities just don't have the time or the resources or the ability to stand up in these meetings and have their voice really be heard. So all of these meetings are always going to be about the Big Ten and the SEC and the Big 12 and the ACC and the Pac-12. There's no two ways about that. It's always going to be the thing they're worrying about, and it really kind of showed itself in the way that this was broken down from a percentage perspective. When you talk about how much each team is losing per year, it's definitely a little bit more is coming out of the pockets of these smaller schools. Obviously, there are more smaller schools to pay that, but even the percentage of money coming out of their revenue per year is higher than it is for the bigger conferences, which, if you were to ask me, doesn't make much a lick of sense, if I'm being totally honest, but that's the reality that we live in. College football is in a point where you kind of have to steer into your biggest assets, which are the Big Ten and the SEC, because at the end of the day, right now, you're just trying to stay afloat. You're trying to make sure that everything is in as good of shape as it possibly can be, and the way you do that, unfortunately, the way you do that for the vast majority of the sport is making sure that the big boys are okay. And that's definitely something that is obviously at the forefront of the NCAA's mind and the mind of the people covering the House on this one. There's definitely Jeffrey Kessler is the lead attorney on this one, and I'm sure he understands the landscape as well as anyone at this point, where you got to make sure that the agreement favors the big guys, because then you get the NCAA involved, and then you get the power conferences to approve this, which is the biggest hurdle that they were going to face. So this is obviously going to be a huge topic of conversation. In fact, we'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow after likely the SEC and the Pac-12 have agreed to this. We're going to have Andrew Tate on again, and as well as Samantha Genzer over from the Hoops and Heels podcast. So we'll definitely get into that a little bit more deeply tomorrow. I'll show you guys kind of what the actual breakup is. But one of the things we talked about, especially earlier in the week, was how this was going to affect the smaller conferences, and not just, the Group of Five or the FCS or all of those guys, but what are called the CCA 22s, which are essentially the conferences that don't have an FBS football program, which is obviously a huge revenue builder. So obviously these schools have a little bit less ability to keep up in that type of realm, and they tried their best to kind of offset this to try to possibly even get a little bit more money going their direction. Didn't quite happen. It sounds like the D2 and D3 programs are safe as of right now. Obviously, that could change over the next couple of days, but if the SEC and the Big 12, or the Pac-12, excuse me, if they get involved in this and approve it, it's pretty much set in stone, and that's just kind of the way it is. And the question is, obviously, how do people kind of react to this? How do they adapt to this? And it's something that we'll definitely get into in a little bit more depth in the next segment. But the reality is there's a lot of money that's going to have to be paid by a lot of schools that don't have the money to pay it, to be totally honest. There are a lot of, I think, misunderstandings when we talk about athletic departments across the country, where I fully understand that, Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, all of those schools are not hurting for cash. They are never going to be in the problem where $20 million is not necessarily an issue for Ohio State year over year. I think they made $256 million in revenue a year ago. So obviously that's not going to be as big of a problem for them. But you'd be surprised how quickly that can happen, whether it's a Power 5 program that just doesn't quite have $20 million to throw around. It's not that they couldn't do it necessarily, but then you got to pull money away from some other sports, and you're obviously going to start with some of the smaller sports, which is something we'll definitely talk to Samantha about tomorrow, because this doesn't just have implications in college football. Let's be totally honest, college football is likely going to be okay. Obviously, it's under a lot of different changes and a lot of different things going on, and some people are not too enthused by what's going on in college football, as am I, but the reality is, when all of this stuff is going on and all of this stuff is being decided, they're worrying about college football, and they're not so much worrying about many other things around the sport, around college sports. So college football will be okay. I don't necessarily worry about their ability to get this, a good chunk of that $20 million and be able to utilize it the way they see fit. You got to worry about, the softball team. You got to worry about the swimming team. You have to worry about the other teams around these schools, because it really doesn't matter who you are, right? It doesn't necessarily matter if you're Ohio State or if you're Toledo. There are difficult decisions that are going to have to be made, and especially if you're in a world where everything is about competing, especially in college football in particular. If you're one of those big schools, you have to compete every single year, and you're going to have to do it while outbidding a lot of other teams in that process. And I think it opens a door where even the Ohio States of the world could make some decisions that we don't necessarily love, but would funnel more money into the big money maker that they have, which is football. So it's a very precarious situation. It really is. I think this is obviously something that probably had to happen if you're talking from the NCAA's perspective, where you can't have lawsuits on your hand, and you absolutely can't have 4 of them and they just keep stacking up. And this will get rid of at least 3 major antitrust lawsuits that have been hanging over their head for quite some time. Now, the question is, does that do away with lawsuits against the NCAA? Probably not. I tend to believe that there will still be ways to come after the NCAA for back pay payments, for some different things that have gone on in the past that they have kind of admitted are not the right way to go about business. And the question I guess I have is, what happens when all of that goes down? Because right now, the NCAA, it feels like a lot of people reporting on this, or have talked to the people in the NCAA, are kind of working under the assumption that this solves all of their problems all at once, at least in the courtroom. And I don't necessarily view that the same, and I don't necessarily know why they would. So it's one of those things where you have this big time question mark around the NCAA, whether you're a small conference, a big conference, it doesn't necessarily matter. You're going to have some decisions to make over the next little bit that you didn't have to make 5 years ago, or you didn't even have to make 2 years ago. So it's going to be fascinating to kind of watch this all unfold, but also from the NCAA's perspective, they got this monkey off their back, but it doesn't mean another one's not going to jump on very, very quickly. So I guess you fix the problem for today, which is obviously, at this point in college sports, maybe that's just the ultimate goal, is just keep putting out fires as you go and hope that you land on your feet at the end of it. But from where I'm standing, from where, I think a lot of people are watching this from, they're realizing this is really just, getting this out of the way, and then you can deal with the future of college football and the future of college sports, which is still remarkably murky. But you had to get this across. You had to make sure that the NCAA did not have these lawsuits over their head. And what the future holds, we'll figure out as we come. But at the very least, they're making strides into getting some type of answer to NIL, some type of answer to the future of college football. Now, it could come at the expense of some of the smaller schools or some of the smaller sports at the bigger schools, but I guess that's the game that we're playing now. Once you add a ton of money into the conversation, especially going directly towards the players from the schools, you open up a lot of doors for some decisions to be made that will hurt a number of people. But at the end of the day, you're sitting here and trying to figure out how to make the books work, and sometimes that swimming team becomes a little bit more expensive than you hope they would, but that's kind of the reality of college sports right now. But we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how some of the teams are kind of dealing with this. We have a big-time solution that is not necessarily the one that I would love to have, but it's the reality of the sport. You got to find money somewhere, and private equity might just be that place. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the NCAA versus House case and how that settlement is coming more and more close to being reality. And with that becomes a big time pay that is going to have to be doled out from these colleges. And the question is, how do you deal with that? And one of the big answers that has kind of been popping up recently is private equity. Obviously, this new deal is going to cost $300 million over the next 10 years, whether it's from pulling money away from what you get from the NCAA or paying that revenue sharing. There's going to be a lot of money going towards this over the next decade, and not everyone has that money, as we talked about, and it's definitely something where they're really looking for any answer they can get. And Drew Weatherford is someone that is more than willing to give them that answer. He is a former Florida State quarterback that has been, I think, played there from about 2007 to 2010 in that kind of range, and since then has become kind of a private equity trader, has become a very, very, powerful, successful guy. He's opened Redbird Capital and Weatherford Capital that are two programs that are kind of coming together to create collegiate athletic solutions. So this is kind of a new program. We've heard a lot of different new entities been popped up around college sports. This is just the newest in that line, and it's very interesting. It's one of those things where you look at it from the outset and you have a lot of questions, right? It is a entity that has very little to do with the NCAA, very little to do with a lot of the rules that overarch the NCAA, and they're trying to get into the game. And the question is, I guess, how will this kind of affect the future of college football, the future of college sports, and how will it affect the decision making in these rooms, in these athletic departments? Because they have said in a lot of their conversations that they have no interest in being a part of the decision making. They have no interest in how these teams spend the money. They just want to give the money to the teams to make their ends meet. And I'd love to believe that. I really would love to be, totally believe that this is totally out of the kindness of their hearts and they're doing their best to save college sports. And that sounds like a great thing, but I'm a little bit skeptical of that just because of what has happened around college football and college sports over the last little bit. It's been a little bit sketchy, right? And there's not necessarily been a ton of people around, especially in big-time positions of power, that have necessarily had the greatest, had the sport's best interest at heart, I suppose is the best way to put it. And I hope that this is a little bit different, but I suppose we'll find out. It sounds like Weatherford and Cardinale, who is his partner, Jerry Cardinale, are seeking about 5 to 10 programs to give as little as $50 million, as much as $200 million to. I don't know what that looks like in terms of payments. I don't know what that looks like in terms of who's going to be involved in those programs. They say they don't want any power. They say they don't want a position within the athletic department. I would find that a little bit hard to believe if you're writing over a check for $200 million to someone, but maybe they're really doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. Maybe they're really doing this for the right reasons, and I suppose we'll find out. They are not necessarily new to sports by any means. They acquired AC Milan, who's a massive football team across in Italy, worth about $1.3 billion. They bought it back in 2022. They're in Formula One. They're in Fenway Sports Group, which is the Boston Red Sox owners. They're in Liverpool is another one they're involved in. So they're very much involved in sports and have been for quite some time. So this is not necessarily new to them. Now, it is a little bit new to college sports. It's not necessarily new to college in general. There are a lot of endowments that come from a number of different places. They just are rarely used in the athletic department in that way. So it's going to be really interesting. It's one of those things where at face value, you really want it to be just that, right? You want it to be exactly what they're saying it is, which is essentially an angel investment, essentially just something to keep all of these programs alive, something to make sure that college sports keep going as well as they can throughout this next little bit, which is going to cost them a ton of money and do things to some athletic departments that we don't want to see. And the question is, first, what does this money look like? How does this how does this bear itself out in real time? What are the actual real impact of the money outside of, being able to pay those bills? Are there, additional asterisks added onto that? Are there, people involved in decision making that probably shouldn't be there? It's a very murky situation, but also it's hard to blame some of the schools for going this route or for trying to go this route, because you look at everything going on around the country and you look at some of the books that are around athletic departments around the country. Some just absolutely need this to stay alive, and that's what they've said in this article. It's literally a question to one of the people very much involved in this, one of the athletic directors. They asked him, do you need this to be successful and survive? And he said yes. So it's very plainly, this is just the reality of the sport. If you're going to ask them to pay $300 million over the next 10 years, it's going to be hard for them to look internally and just say, we got to fundraise that amount of money. They just can't to a certain extent. So it's going to be one of those things that not only is going to be fascinating to watch which teams are involved, which I think is a conversation that is going to be really interesting, right? When you look at what teams could be involved, obviously the Big Ten and the SEC teams are a little bit less worried about this new influx of payments that are going to have to come. That's just the reality of where they stand. They have a little bit more ability to give out that $20 million. Now, not everyone in the SEC or the Big Ten are on the same footing, of course, but they do definitely have a little bit more of ability to foot this bill. Now, does Oregon State, does Washington State, do these other schools that are just a tier below them, but the books are kind of sketchy at times? I mean, we talked about UCLA, who are in the Big Ten. They are massively in debt when you talk about their athletic department, and it's been that way for the past couple of years. At some point, you got to start digging yourself out of that hole. And if this is the answer that they have to give for that, I don't necessarily blame them for doing it. Obviously, it's not what you want. It's not necessarily the way that I would love for this to go about, but you're looking around and you're saying, pay $300 million over the next 10 years, but also asking them to do it, entirely above board and not go out of their walls to get it is a little bit unrealistic, right? You don't necessarily have donors that are willing to give up that amount of money every single year for you to go about your business. So this is something that is very dangerous. I'll be totally honest. I don't necessarily know what this looks like in real time. I'm having a little bit hard time believing that this is fully out of the kindness of their heart, just trying to save college sports. I'd love to believe that, and him being a former college football player definitely does help that case a little bit, but I don't know. It's a very, very interesting situation where I don't really know how all of this fits in. I don't really know how private equity works in college sports. I don't really know where this money will go, and I don't really know if it necessarily will lead to many great things in this sport. But I do know that it kind of forced some teams' hand. And you hate to say that that's the reality, but when you look across the sport, everyone's on such uneven footing that at some point you got to do something to keep up. And if that's, adding a rocket booster of $200 million to your back, that's sometimes just what's got to happen. And it's definitely something that's going to be fascinating to watch. Is it the ACC and the Big 12 that take really good advantage of this? Is it Group of 5 teams? How much money goes out to these programs, and how is that money used? There's a million questions, and that's always going to be the case when someone like this from the outside comes into the sport and has this big of an effect, but it's kind of the reality that we live in. If you're in Tulane right now and you're trying to make those books work, especially with $20 million coming up next year, you got to go somewhere to find the money. And you have to do it relatively quickly because these payments aren't coming, 5 years down the road. They're coming pretty much tomorrow, and you got to be ready for them. So it's going to be fascinating to watch all of this unfold. The way I look at it, it is a dangerous proposition, but maybe the only option for some of these athletic departments across the country. Now, can the NCAA step in and do something? Can they make this at least a little bit more above board than it seems like it will be right now? That's the hope, but from where I'm standing, the NCAA doesn't necessarily have a ton of power to do much. So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think this is the center of the storm. We've talked about a million different things on this show about the different changes and the different craziness going on around college sports and college football in particular. And we're right now in the eye of the storm. There's really no other way to put it. There's so much stuff changing. There's so many teams moving all over the place. There's so much sketchy happenings around college sports right now. But the reality is, I do think we're going to find our way out of it. I do think there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and I'll actually get into that a little bit tomorrow after we finish up with our guests. But the reality is, you can't necessarily ask someone to pay $300 million over 10 years and then not ask them, and then at the same time not ask them to go out and use a little bit different of means to get that money. So it's not necessarily the way I want things to go, but it's the reality of college sports right now. Either you have money or you're not competing, and that's just kind of the way of things. So getting that money from this entity is one solution, and you'll take a solution where you can get it. But we're going to take our second break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about James Franklin. There were some very interesting allegations against him about possibly interfering with some medical decisions that were going on at Penn State. I'll get into the details of that and break down just how big of a deal this actually is and how it will affect James Franklin going forward. So stick around, and we will be right back with that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the craziness that is the NCAA versus the House and how private equity might be the answer for some of the athletic departments across the country. But let's jump into James Franklin and let's talk about this very interesting story that came out yesterday about him possibly interfering with some medical decisions at Penn State. This is something that came out from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and they were talking to a former team doctor at Penn State that started when James Franklin started at Penn State in 2014. His name is Dr. Pete Seidenberg, and he was talking about a trial that is ongoing that was filed by Dr. Scott Lynch, who was also involved in the athletic department, in the medicine department of the athletic department there. And they served in those roles for quite some time. Seidenberg had been there since 2014. Lynch had been there since 2019. So all of these incidences have happened over the last couple of years, and it's something that is definitely very interesting to kind of follow. And I'm not necessarily sure what the exact details of the case are, but I do know one of the conversations that was happening, or one of the stories that was detailed by Lynch in this case and by Seidenberg to the Philadelphia Inquirer, was talking about a player, and it was talking about James Franklin and the athletic director, Sandy Barber. They were talking about a specific player who will remain nameless here, obviously. Apparently, he had attempted suicide and wanted to be medically disqualified from the team while receiving, treatment for this issue that he was dealing with. A medical disqualification that Franklin and the athletic director were pushing for would take away the kid's scholarship and would not give him a spot on the team going forward. This is obviously something that is not ideal. Seidenberg and Lynch declined that request from Franklin and Sandy Barber, and it's very interesting. Apparently, there were a number of meetings where they felt like he was pushing them in one direction to do treatment a certain way or give options to certain players that might not be in their best interests. And the big quote here, I suppose, I don't necessarily want to go too deep in this before saying this, where Lynch during these proceedings said, after he was talking about all of this stuff, he said, "I perceived that as his attempt to influence medical decisions." And I think that's kind of a big thing here. It's not necessarily to say that James Franklin didn't do a ton of things wrong in this scenario. If that is true, the story that I just told you about the kid, that they were trying to get his scholarship essentially taken away and medical disqualification, trying to get that is definitely not ideal. And if that's the story, if that's the real story, then we got some problems in our sport, and especially over at Penn State, and that has to be dealt with. But the reality is, from where I'm standing, James Franklin is a very good man. I have very little reason to believe that now. If this comes out to be true, then I have a big reason to believe that he's not so great of a man. But the reality is, I don't necessarily want to bury anyone doing this. I don't necessarily want to say he absolutely did this or absolutely went after someone in this way, because it's a pretty aggressive allegation. Let's be totally honest. When you're talking about a kid that is dealing with what that kid was obviously dealing with, and handling it that way is rather aggressive, and definitely something that you don't want in college sports. And I fully understand that football is the way it is, right? Football is aggressive. It's unforgiving. It's cutthroat. It's everything in between. It's going to be one of the sports where when you're on the field, you're going to get yelled at, and you're going to get, they're going to tear you apart a little bit, and it's going to be a little aggressive, and you got to have thick skin at times. But the reality is, we've let that kind of permeate throughout the entire sport. And it's not necessarily just about being on the field and being intense and being about it and being all in on your guys and maybe yelling a little bit more and being fully engaged, but it's going across everything. And it's not necessarily just an on-the-field issue. It's an off-the-field issue where these guys just feel like they're can't do certain things because it's not the football mentality. And that's a whole other problem, which we can get to as we kind of go a little bit deeper in this show. But the reality is, when you look at college football and you look at the facilities and you look at all of the ability that some of these programs have, especially from a football perspective, the idea that you would have any gaps in your medical coverage, the fact that you would have any issue with this type of thing is a little bit crazy to me. And I understand that everyone's kind of coming around on this, getting more mental health people in the building and making sure that's a bigger part of your conversation. But it should have been a long time ago. And the reality is, even if, the conversation started a couple of years ago, the infrastructure should be in place pretty quickly. And I don't know when all of this stuff happened. I don't necessarily want to say that Penn State is handling this, entirely wrong, because I don't know the details of how they're specifically handling it. I just know that if the story is true, where you would, medically disqualify someone, lose a scholarship for a kid that is dealing with that type of thing, you have problems that need to be fixed, point blank, period. And it's a problem that kind of happens around sports and around football in particular, where you have coaches that operate a certain way and they refuse to adapt to different circumstances. But the reality is, we live in a different world now. A lot of these coaches grew up when you were playing football, and that's all you were doing. You weren't necessarily having to worry about doing NIL stuff. You weren't necessarily having to worry about social media, which is probably the biggest factor in all of this, where this is an entirely different world. And these kids are dealing with things that most of us could not even comprehend on a daily basis in terms of their mental health, in terms of their physical health. They're dealing with things that are just absolutely insane. And they're really young kids is the big capper here that I feel like everyone has started to shy away from with the introduction of NIL. These are still kids. And I understand they're making a lot of money and they're doing this thing that is a professional sport, but at the end of the day, they still need to be handled with a little bit of care. And it's not to say that James Franklin isn't doing that. From my point of view, he has seemed to be a very, very loving, very caring coach, but this story makes me a little bit nervous about that idea. And when you look at some of the greatest coaches ever, especially of recent history, when you look at the Nick Sabans of the world, especially Nick Saban and Kirby Smart are the two that it really stands out the most to me. Is on the field, these guys are as aggressive, as intense. They will yell, they will get in your face, they will do everything they need to do to get the best football out of you. That's just the way they are, that's the way they're wired. Off the field, there is no question what these guys feel about their kids. There's no question that they absolutely care about their players. There's no question that they want them to be happy and healthy. And there's no question that if some of their players came to them with some of these worries, they would be fully behind them, because this is not a hard decision to make. That's the reality of if you're really that worried about one scholarship out of 85 for 1 year, you have a problem. It's not necessarily that, I understand that figuring out these scholarships is not the easiest thing in the world. Roster construction is not the easiest thing in the world, but it's a very easy decision to make. If you play 1 year with 84 scholarship guys instead of 85 scholarship guys, that won't kill you. I promise. That will not kill you. Maybe you'll have a walk-on guy that just plays a little bit more football, and that's the way it is. So I understand that this is all a very, very new concept, and all of this is very, very confusing, and some of it is making decisions that are tough to make. And I fully understand. I don't necessarily envy the position that a lot of these coaches are in with a lot of the new things that are being thrown at them. But from my point of view, at least, when you're dealing with a kid that obviously was going through something that was very intense for him, obviously, created a lot of problems in his life, the idea that, you can't just say, we're keeping you on scholarship, that's the way it's going to be, and move on, is a little wild to me. You're Penn State. You're not Toledo. You're not Miami of Ohio. You're not, struggling for money. You're not struggling for dudes that can play on the football field. So I really hope this isn't true. I'll be totally honest with you. I really hope this isn't fully the truth. I think there might be some gray area in between where this falls, but if it is, Penn State has problems they need to address. If it is, James Franklin, in my opinion, needs to start arguing why he should be a head coach at the college football level. And maybe that sounds like an overreaction. Maybe I'm being a little aggressive in that. But the reality is, if your kids aren't showing up to your offices, to your facility, to your practices, and not feeling, good, not feeling happy, not feeling safe, you have a problem with your team. Whether it's, going to find itself on the field and show itself on the field or off the field, I don't know. But you do have a problem with your team. And for so many reasons, I hope that this isn't the real story. For so many reasons, I hope that this wasn't the way that this was handled. But if it was, I think there's really valid questions that need to be asked about the way that Penn State is going about business in their football program and the way that James Franklin views some of these things. So it's one of those stories that you see and you almost don't believe it because of the person that, I think a lot of us assume James Franklin to be, and I don't necessarily have fully gone off that take by any means, because from where I'm standing, he's always been a very stand-up guy that's cared about his kids, that has put his players first. But this is a pretty upsetting story. I'll be totally honest, and we'll figure out what happens with it. We'll figure out if there's any repercussions for James Franklin in the future, but it's the reality of the sport, right? A lot of adaptation is going to need to happen, especially in the world of mental health, because it's not something that a lot of college football teams had to deal with even, 10, 15 years ago, because it wasn't something that was as prevalent in this game. And with social media, with all of the stuff that these guys have to deal with, it's going to be more prevalent. And the easiest decision in the world should be to keep that guy on scholarship and let him deal with whatever he has to deal with to the side of the team. So it's one of those stories that you see and you really hope is not true. You really hope that this is not the way that it fully went down, but I wish I could tell you that I'm confident that it's not the way it went down. I wish I could tell you that I'm confident that this isn't the way that college football works, but it might just be. So it's one of those upsetting stories. It's one of those worrisome stories, but I'm giving James Franklin the benefit of the doubt until I, see more information about this. But we're going to take our third break here, and then we'll get to some football. I know it's been a very, very hectic first couple of segments here, but we're going to talk about USC, and we're going to talk about if they are ready for the Big Ten this upcoming year, and if they're ready for it going forward. Definitely some big-time holes and some big-time changes that are being made over there. So we'll break down how they kind of are looking towards the Big Ten right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about James Franklin and some very troubling allegations against him about possibly interfering with some medical decisions around the Penn State program. definitely not what you want to hear, but we'll see what happens with that, and we'll definitely update you with that as it kind of comes out. But let's talk about USC, and let's talk about them going into the Big Ten. We talked about Oklahoma into the SEC early last week or early this week. I can't exactly remember. But I wanted to go over to the Big Ten, and I feel like USC might be the most interesting team going into the Big Ten for a number of reasons. So let's start to break this stuff down and get into why I think this is. So Lincoln Riley has obviously made a huge jump this offseason. He has made probably what is the biggest single decision of any coach across the country this offseason, which is essentially just change what he's about. Change the way that his program goes about business, change the way that they practice, change the way that they lift in the locker room, the way they do very specific things has all got to change. And I think we all understand that. Watching Lincoln Riley over the last 6-7 years, it's the same formula. It's the team that if they're not going to outscore you, they're going to lose, and that's just the way it is. They're going to have to run up the score a lot of the time. They're not going to have a ton of defense that is going to play really aggressively, but he's trying to change that. He's finally figured out that is not necessarily a way that you're going to win a title, and he's taken a big step to kind of fix that and bringing in DeAnton Lynn. I think this is one of those guys that is one of the biggest risers in our sport right now. Will definitely be will definitely be talked about much more as we kind of go throughout the next couple of seasons with USC. But he's coming over from UCLA, which is definitely something USC fans probably loved about that. And every single video, every interview, every practice you see from this guy, you really want to play for him. He's just one of those guys that's very infectious, that has that energy about him that you can understand why guys really respond to him. And they just picked up a big-time transfer in Gavin Mayer over from Wyoming, a defensive lineman that will definitely help them out next to Bear Alexander. But when you talk about the UCLA defense and what DeAnton Lynn did to it is just insane. They were 87 in 2022 overall, and they were number 11 in the country a year ago. And that's not necessarily with the most outright incredible talent. Now, they did have Liatu Latu, who was the top defender off the board in this NFL draft, but beyond that, they didn't necessarily have a ton of big-time players. It wasn't like the Michigan defense that had dudes all over the field. There were definitely a couple of gaps, but he made it all work. They were first in the nation in rushing defense, allowing a little under 70 yards a game. They were second in yards per rush. They were third in nation in sacks per game, with a little bit more than 3. So this guy knows how to coach defense, is the bottom line here. This guy knows what he's doing on the defensive side of the ball, and he does not shy away by any means of creating a very hard-nosed team. When we watched UCLA a year ago, it felt like they had a chip on their shoulder at every second of the day. And I think DeAnton Lynn was a huge reason for that. I think there was just an energy in that locker room. There was an energy in those facilities that was a little unlike anything they've ever had. And frankly, I think Deshaun Foster is going to keep that going over there because he has just insane amounts of energy as well. Love those two guys in this industry going forward. But the reality is DeAnton Lynn coming over to USC is huge, not only because he can call a great defense, but because he's going to get guys right. If you're not right, you're going to find your way out the door. And that's just kind of the way it works around there. We saw a ton of guys leave this past offseason, and I don't think there was necessarily as big of a worry around USC as there was everywhere else looking at USC. I think a lot of people were watching that saying, well, they're in trouble again. They're going to be a terrible defense again. And I didn't necessarily see it that way. I think a lot of guys left that had to leave. I think a lot of guys left that weren't willing to do some of the things that had to be done for them to win football games. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't lose a couple of big-time players. I think losing Tackett Curtis was a huge loss for them. Definitely would have been a big-time player for them. But the reality is, when you're making this big of a flip, when you're totally flipping your culture on its head and you're trying to play more hard-nosed defensive-style football, some guys just aren't going to fit the mold, and that's just kind of the way of things, and you have to take that as you will and continue to move forward. So USC, when you look at the defense from a roster perspective, it's not the craziest thing in the world. There's no two ways about that. They definitely are not the place that they want to be, but when you have guys like Bear Alexander, when you brought in Gavin Mayer, it's an absolutely huge pickup. When you have Eric Gentry, a very talented linebacker, there are some things that you can do on defense that I think some people might just be assuming USC can't do. because they're USC and because it's Lincoln Riley. And to be honest, I kind of understand that. I understand not being super inclined to believe that Lincoln Riley can put together a hard-nosed team, but he's making every single step to do that. And he's doing it way quicker than I thought he would, if I'm being totally honest. It feels like everything I watch out of USC right now just has a little bit different energy. It's not necessarily to say that they've entirely flipped that thing and they're going to be a dominant defense by any means. In fact, they'll probably be a little bit below average this upcoming year on defense. Not necessarily bad like they were a year ago, which I think they were 117th in the country or something like that. But I think they'll be good. And I think part of that is just when you're watching practices with this USC team, there's an energy on that field that hasn't been there in the past. There is a certain anger that these guys play with that has not been there in the past, especially on Lincoln Riley's teams. And it's something that, doesn't necessarily mean too much until you get on the field, obviously, and doesn't necessarily mean too much until you do something with it. But it feels like the energy around that program is different. It feels like they are really buying into this new culture, this new way of things for Lincoln Riley and for USC. And I think it's going to pay dividends. When you look at Lincoln Riley, he's going to score points. There's very, very little chance that he does not score a lot of points this upcoming year. Obviously, facing some tougher defenses, dealing with some things that he didn't have to deal with in the past. But when you have Lincoln Riley on your staff, you're going to score a good amount of points. You're going to be one of the top 20 offenses in the country. And then you just got to play opportunistic defense, right? You don't necessarily have to be the dominant defense that UCLA was a year ago. You just have to make the right plays at the right times. And obviously that's easier said than done. But I do think there are a number of people out there in SoCal that can make those plays. And I think bringing DeAnton Lynn in is an absolutely huge hire. Now, what does all this mean for 2024? It's hard to say. I don't really have a good idea of what they're going to look like in 2024. Overall, are they ready for the Big Ten right this second? I'd probably say no. If we're talking about the physicality perspective, or we're talking about being able to keep up with these teams on a weekly basis, I tend to believe that the answer is going to be no. But I think that's just right now. I think if we're going into 2025, 26, 27, I think you're going to see an entirely different USC program. And I think you're going to see them be a big-time part of the conversation in the Big Ten going forward. I think people don't fully understand. I mean, I think a lot of people understand this, but the reality is you hit 1 year at USC and a lot of stuff takes care of itself, where you have a lot of guys portaling in. The recruiting becomes a lot easier to Southern California once you start winning those games. And it might not be in 2024, but I do think coming down the road, you're going to see a USC team that is just a little bit different than it has been in the past, and a Lincoln Riley that is a little bit different than it has been in the past. So everything they need is at USC, and more is coming over the next couple of years. But I don't think they're necessarily ready right this second, but USC is going to be a big topic of conversation in the Big Ten going forward, and I think the defense will be more than fine in a couple of years, but 2024 might be a little bit tougher. But let's take our last break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a Hot Take Thursday. We're going to break down the Heisman ceremony and how I think we might just have a very diverse group of guys up there from a position perspective, and definitely want to break that down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about USC and if they are ready for the Big Ten this upcoming year. Probably not this upcoming year, but I do think down the road they'll be more than fine over there in Southern California. But let's start to break down the Heisman ceremony. And I have a hot take here. I do think there's going to be 3 positions in New York City for the Heisman ceremony. Now, this is something that sounds a little bit crazy right now because the last couple of years have been pretty much all quarterbacks. A wide receiver here and there. We had Marvin Harrison Jr. a year ago. We've had a running back from time to time, but definitely dominated by quarterbacks. It's become kind of the best quarterback in the country award, but this hasn't happened since 2016, where you had Lamar Jackson, Baker Mayfield, Jabril Peppers, which is a huge help to this, getting a defensive player in there. Deshaun Watson and Dede Westbrook also made it up to NYC, but the reality is, before 2016, this was happening pretty frequently. In 2009, this happened with Ndamukong Suh making it up there. In 2011 through 2014, this happened. So you had guys like Tyrann Mathieu, you had Manti Te'o helping this out along the way. So having a defensive player helps this a ton, obviously. You know, whenever you can add a player from the other side of the ball to that ceremony, it makes things a little bit easier to get all of these positions in. But the reality is I could go 4 or 5 positions deep and give you at least a couple of guys that have that shot to win this trophy, and that's exactly what I did. So let's break these down real quick. Quarterback is obviously totally wide open. There's really no other way to put it. This is one where, given any circumstance, a number of guys could be here. Cam Ward could obviously be in the mix. I mean, a number of guys could really make this jump and be a Heisman level quarterback, just because a lot of guys make that jump. I don't think there were a lot of people betting on Jaden Daniels to be your Heisman winner before the season started, and then he came out of nowhere, or not necessarily out of nowhere, but came up and had a remarkable year. So obviously quarterback is wide open. We do have Quinn Ewers and Carson Beck kind of leading the way there, but you could go any number of directions with the quarterback position, and you might have a shot to get in that conversation. We'll definitely have a quarterback there. There's no two ways about that. But then you get to running backs, and this is an absolutely loaded group this year. I think you have at least 5 or 6 guys that could make their way into this conversation. Travion Henderson, Jaden Ott, Amarian Hampton, Ollie Gordon, all of those guys are going to be huge. Quinshon Judkins, another one. And then you have guys like Taj Brooks, Dylan Edwards, maybe Trevor Etienne. All of these guys are capable of having big-time years. Now, it's a little bit harder for some of those other guys. I do think that guys like Jaden Ott, Amarian Hampton, Ollie Gordon, a ton of their offense is going to be predicated on them being big-time players, and I think that obviously lends itself to them being possible Heisman favorites towards the end of the year. When you talk about wide receivers, it starts with Luther Burden and McMillan. There's no two ways about that. Those are going to be the guys that are going to be the most fun to watch. They definitely have that rapport with their quarterback, which helps them be the big-time receiver on their teams and could put up some crazy seasons. And then you have guys like Isaiah Bond that might be able to put up a wild season, Devontae Smith-esque type season, especially with Steve Sarkisian calling plays as he was with Devontae Smith back in the day. Or maybe Emeka Egbuka has a fantastic year for Ohio State. I think both those guys are fairly long shots. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I do honestly kind of like Luther Burden to make his way up to New York at the end of the year, but we'll get into my official predictions a little bit later in the offseason. Edge rusher is another one that I'm watching in particular. James Pierce Jr. and Abdul Carter are 2 guys that I think definitely have a really big shot to do this, not only because they're incredible rushing the passer, but they're going to be asked to do a lot for their defenses to succeed. And then you have guys like Michael Williams, who I think is going to take a massive step this upcoming year, be an absolute dominant edge rusher for Georgia. And then you have Patrick Payton, who's going to be a huge player for Florida State this upcoming year, likely their best defensive player right now, and definitely will be a huge player for them this upcoming year. And then you get into DBs, and you have Travis Hunter obviously leading the way. When you have a guy that plays both ways, like a Jabril Peppers, it obviously helps that a little bit. And when you talk about the numbers that Travis Hunter can put up, it's going to be better than Jabril Peppers put up. No disrespect to Jabril, he was an incredible player at Michigan, but when you're able to be on the both sides of the ball as much as Travis Hunter is, you have the ability to put up just crazy numbers. So he definitely is leading the way there. But Caleb Downs, I think, could have a Heisman finalist type of year. If he can put together a year like he did at Alabama a year ago, where you have more than 100 tackles, you have a couple of picks here and there, obviously you're likely going to have to do a little bit more. But if you are the leader of the best defense in the country and making the type of plays that Caleb Downs is capable of making, it gets really interesting really quickly. And then you have Will Johnson out there. He would likely need a remarkable year, to be totally honest, where he goes, 8 picks or something absolutely insane. But I do think he has the ability to make some really, really incredible plays, and possibly he's the leader of the best defense in the country at Michigan. So who knows what happens there. Also, another guy that I thought of actually like right before the show started was Harold Perkins, a linebacker from LSU, kind of the same vein of James Pierce Jr. and Abdul Carter, where you look at them not only as remarkable players, but guys that if their defense is going to be what it needs to be for them to be successful, those guys are going to be as important as anyone in the country. And they're definitely going to be huge players for those defenses. So maybe Harold Perkins puts it all together. Maybe Blake Baker puts him in the right situations finally for that kid, and he shows off his remarkable ability. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch all of this unfold. Obviously, this has kind of gone by the wayside the last couple of years with multiple different positions making their way to New York City, but there's so many good players in this group. When I look at this season, there's so much stuff to kind of pull from this overall season coming up. And when you look across the country, there is talent just sprinkled all over the field. I don't think there's a team that you're going to watch that doesn't have a really elite player on it. I don't think there's a section of the field that doesn't have a number of elite players across the country at it. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think some of this lends itself to the quarterbacks not necessarily being quite as clear-cut as they were a year ago. Obviously, that's rarely the case with the Heisman, where someone can come out of nowhere and steal the show. But the reality is there is not necessarily that solid quarterback that you feel is definitely going to be in the Heisman conversation no matter what, like there has been kind of in years past. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. I don't necessarily know who I would pick as the three guys to represent the positions at the ceremony, but I do know running back is as deep as it possibly gets in college football this upcoming year. So many incredible players across the country that could make some noise. The wide receiver with Luther Burden and Tatoria McMillan, both those guys are going to put up insane numbers. There's no doubt about that. With them and their quarterbacks having that rapport, it's going to be insane, the numbers they're able to put up. Now, can they do enough to get to New York City? That's a whole other question. But they absolutely will be big-time players, will absolutely put up as good of numbers as anyone in the entire country across positions. So very excited for that wide receiver group. And then when you look at the defensive side of the ball, it just feels like there's so many guys that could absolutely make that leap and be the biggest, game changers for their team. James Pierce Jr., I think, leads that list, where if he walks out of the season with, 16 sacks and 22 and a half tackles for loss and some ridiculous numbers in between, I think he could be that guy. He could be the guy that you really look at. And Shedeur Sanders, another fantastic one, absolutely. Definitely someone that could get up into that conversation, especially if Colorado makes some noise this upcoming year, where people want to give Colorado a little bit of a shine. And if Shedeur Sanders can have some of that protection, he's a name that absolutely could pop up. And then, obviously, Travis Hunter is the biggest wrinkle to this. When you talk about a guy that plays both sides of the ball, that is absolutely going to play probably about 130 to 120 snaps every single game, you have the ability to be the best player in the country. I frankly think he's at least top 10 in the country when you talk about players, and he's one of the most successful two-way players we've seen in a really, really, really long time. He's someone that can totally change the game on the defensive side of the ball, and then to go score a touchdown on offense. He could literally do the entire thing for Colorado in a game. He could win a game by himself. So he's someone that I think for this prediction to come true, he might have to be there, frankly. There might have to be a defensive player that makes their way up to New York City at the end of the day. But when you look at Travis Hunter this upcoming year, he's going to put up numbers that are just going to be ridiculous. And he's going to do things that are just going to be highlight reel after highlight reel. And when you're coming from Colorado and you have Deion Sanders as your coach, they're going to want to boost that up as much as possible. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think there's so many players that have their claim to possibly getting into that New York City conversation for the Heisman, but I think we're going to have a ton of really, really good players. And I think we're going to have a ton of remarkable players, not only from the big schools that are always in the conversation for the Heisman, but from Colorado with Travis Hunter and Shedeur Sanders, from maybe Cal with Jaden Ott. You have so many different people across the country that absolutely could make some noise here. And I think we might just have a really interesting group up in New York City at the end of the year. I think that we might have 5 guys up there just because it's going to be a fascinating year with a ton of big-time players across the country. So I do think it's going to be a really interesting Heisman ceremony. I do think the battle for the Heisman is going to be really, really tough. And I think there's going to be about 5 or 6 guys that you could argue should be in New York at the end of the day. I just hope that they come from some different positions for the sake of this take. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have incredible people doing work across every single sport you could possibly want. So definitely come on over to GSMC and we will have you covered there. We'll have Andrew Tate and Samantha Genzer on tomorrow to talk about all of the stuff around college football and all of the craziness. But we will see you then, and thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of